The first time someone told me I was born a sinner, I was 8 years old. I remember the room. First Baptist Church of Knoxville, Tennessee. The Sunday school annex in the basement. Fluorescent lights that buzzed a little too loud. A drop ceiling with one tile water-stained brown in the corner. The smell of old carpet and the coffee someone had made upstairs in the fellowship hall. My teacher was Mrs. Evelyn Cates. White hair, a brooch every single week without fail. She had been teaching that class since before my parents were married. She was reading from Romans, and she stopped mid-verse, looked up at us over the rim of her reading glasses, and said, "Children, before you ever took a breath, you were already a sinner." That is what the Bible teaches. You were born into sin. Every one of you in this room. I remember looking down at my hands. I want you to hold that image for a second. An 8-year-old boy in a basement Sunday school room in East Tennessee, looking down at his own hands because he has just been told that the hands themselves, the ones he was born with, are evidence of something wrong with him that he did not cause and could not have prevented. I didn't say anything. You didn't argue with Mrs. Evelyn Cates. But something went into me in that room that morning that took 50 years to start coming back out. And I know I am not alone in this, because if there is one thing that runs through the messages this community sends me, more than any particular verse, more than any specific historical discovery, it is this: the specific, persistent ache of having been told, very young, that you were broken before you started, that your best effort would never be enough because the problem was not your behavior. The problem was your nature. The problem was you. That feeling has an address. It has a name. It has a date. And it was contested. Loudly, publicly, scripturally, by some of the most serious Christians who ever lived. Before we go any further, if this kind of investigation is something that matters to you, hit the like button and subscribe to this channel. The algorithm does not surface this content unless people like you tell it to. This kind of research, tracking a doctrine back through 1500 years to the council that made it official, takes weeks. If you want me to keep going, that one click makes all the difference. Now, let me give you the official version first, because I want to give it to you honestly. I want you to feel its weight before I show you what's underneath it. The doctrine of original sin. The specific belief that when Adam and Eve sinned in the Garden of Eden, they transmitted not just mortality, but actual guilt to every human being who would ever be born, is so embedded in Western Christianity that most people assume it is ancient, foundational, practically synonymous with the faith itself. Here is what hundreds of millions of people were taught. God created human beings perfect. Adam and Eve disobeyed. That single act of disobedience corrupted human nature at its root. Not just their nature, but ours. We do not inherit a tendency to sin. We inherit the guilt of that original transgression. We arrive in the world already morally compromised, already bearing a stain we did not personally create, already in need of rescue from a condition we were born into. That is why, in the Western Church, infant baptism is not simply a ritual of welcome or dedication. It is a sacrament of rescue. It washes away a stain the infant brought with it into the world. That is the doctrine. That is what Mrs. Evelyn Cates was reading from Romans that Tuesday morning. That is what has been taught in Catholic and Protestant churches across Europe and the Americas for over 1,500 years. It feels like bedrock. It feels like the oldest thing. But here is the thing. Here is the thing I need you to stay with me on, because this is going to change the shape of something. That specific formulation, original sin as inherited guilt, the idea that you arrived in this world already morally tainted, is not ancient. It is not universal. It was not the position of the majority of Christians in the first 4 centuries of the faith. It was invented. And I use that word carefully because it is accurate and because the people who invented it knew it was new. It was built by one man, One brilliant, troubled, extraordinary man who was working out his own history in the language of theology, and it was made official doctrine by a single church council, a council convened in the year 418 AD in the city of Carthage, in North Africa, in a Roman Empire that was already falling apart. One man, one council, 1 year. And before that council, for nearly 4 centuries of Christian thought, the idea that guilt itself was inherited was not the dominant position. It was contested, debated, and in large parts of the Christian world, explicitly rejected. Stay with me. The man's name was Aurelius Augustinus. We know him as Augustine of Hippo. Augustine was born in 354 AD in Thagaste, a small town in Roman North Africa, in what is now northeastern Algeria. His mother, Monica, was a devout Christian who prayed for his conversion for the better part of 2 decades. His father, Patricius, was a pagan who converted to Christianity late in life. Augustine was raised in the shadow of his mother's faith, but he spent his young adulthood moving through a series of philosophical and religious commitments. Neoplatonism, Manichaeism, a dualistic religion that viewed matter and flesh as fundamentally evil, and what he would later describe, in his Confessions, as a life of sexual indulgence. He had a concubine for 13 years. He had a son with her, a boy named Adeodatus, which means given by God. The boy was clearly gifted. Augustine clearly loved him. Adeodatus died young, not long after Augustine's conversion. Augustine converted to Christianity in Milan in the year 386, at the age of 31. He returned to North Africa, was ordained a priest in 391, and became Bishop of Hippo in 396 AD, a position he held for 34 years, until his death in 430. In those 34 years, he wrote more theology than almost any other figure in the history of Western Christianity. The City of God, on the Trinity, on free will, the Confessions. Book after book, letter after letter, sermon after sermon. He was brilliant. He was prolific. And he was, by his own account, a man who spent a significant portion of his life in something he experienced as moral failure. Now, I want you to hold something in mind. The Confessions is one of the most nakedly honest psychological self-portraits in the ancient world. Augustine writes about his body as a site of conflict, something he could not govern, something that pulled against his will. He writes about the years of his concubinage with a shame that never fully resolves. He asks at one point the prayer that has become famous, "Lord, give me chastity and continence, but not yet." A man laughing at himself, a man who knows what he wants to want and cannot quite get there. When this man turned to the question of why human beings sin, why even people who want to do right so often cannot, he did not arrive at the question from a neutral position. He arrived at it as someone who had lived the problem. His answer, that the will is fundamentally corrupted from birth, that the flesh is the vector of a guilt that cannot be overcome without divine intervention, bears the shape of the man who built it. Elaine Pagels, a Princeton scholar who has spent her career studying early Christianity, makes this argument in her book, Adam, Eve, and the Serpent, published in 1988. Her argument is careful and documented. Augustine's doctrine of original sin, she writes, would have baffled most of his Christian predecessors as well as his pagan and Jewish contemporaries. It was not the ancient consensus, it was, in significant ways, a break from it. But here is where the story turns. Because underneath Augustine's theology, underneath the whole edifice of Western original sin, the doctrine that has told hundreds of millions of people they were born broken, there is a translation error. I want to say that again because I need you to understand what I mean. The entire doctrine of inherited guilt in the Western Church rests centrally and foundationally on a single passage, Romans chapter 5, verse 12. It is the verse that appears to teach that all of humanity sinned in Adam, that the guilt was transmitted through the generations. The New Testament was written in Greek. In the Greek, the phrase reads like this: "Epho pantes hemarton." That phrase, epho, means because of which, or because of whom. It is describing a relationship of consequence. All human beings are subject to death because all human beings sin. They follow the pattern Adam set. They sin on their own account, and they die. Now, Augustine did not read Greek fluently. He read his Bible in Latin. The Latin translation he used, which became the foundation for the Vulgate, the official Bible of Western Christianity for over 1,000 years, rendered that Greek phrase as in quo omnes peccaverunt, in whom all have sinned, as in inside Adam. All of humanity was somehow present inside Adam when he sinned, and therefore all of humanity participated in that original act, and therefore all of humanity carries the inherited guilt of it. That is a completely different claim. The Greek says, because of what Adam did, all have sinned, meaning death spread, because the pattern was followed, because each person has sinned on their own account. The Latin says, in Adam, inside Adam, all have sinned, meaning the guilt was there from the beginning, present in you before you existed as an independent person. John Meyendorff, a Byzantine theologian whose book Byzantine Theology, published in 1974, remains one of the most authoritative studies of the Eastern Orthodox tradition. Documented this translation issue in precise detail. The Eastern Church, which never stopped reading the New Testament in its original Greek, understood Romans 5:12 in almost the opposite way from Augustine. For the Eastern tradition, what Adam transmitted to his descendants was not guilt, it was mortality, the condition of being subject to death in a world where death is now real. Mortality, not guilt. Weakness, not criminality. Fragility, not fundamental corruption. That difference, between what the Greek says and what Augustine read in the Latin, is the difference between being told you are mortal and being told you are guilty. Between being told you are human and being told you are defective. An 8-year-old boy looks down at his hands because the word was in whom, when the word was because of whom. And the church that read the original language never made the same mistake. But here is what I find almost unbearable about this history. Someone noticed? Someone asked the question. Someone said, publicly and in writing, with considerable theological courage, that Augustine's doctrine of inherited guilt was not what the text said, was not what the earliest Christians taught, and was not consistent with a God who was supposed to be just. His name was Pelagius, and what happened to him is the part of this story I have thought about more times than I can count. Pelagius was a British monk, born somewhere around the middle of the 4th century, the exact date and place uncertain. He arrived in Rome around the year 380 AD and spent the following decades as one of the most respected spiritual teachers in the Western Church. Bishops consulted him. Wealthy Roman families sent their sons to him for guidance. He was known for his personal austerity, his serious scholarship, and the quality of his correspondence. And Pelagius had a fundamental problem with what Augustine was building. Not with grace. He was not anti-grace. His argument was more precise than that, and I would argue, more devastating in its simplicity. He asked, how can a just God hold a child guilty for an act the child did not commit? If Adam sinned, Adam bears responsibility for Adam's sin. If you sin, you bear responsibility for your sin. Guilt is moral. It is personal. It follows the person who commits the act. It cannot be biological. It cannot travel through the blood. It cannot arrive in a child before the child has made a single choice. This was Pelagius's argument. And I want you to notice something. It is the same argument your Sunday school self wanted to make and did not, because you were 8 years old and you were in a room with Mrs. Evelyn Cates, and you had already learned that some questions you kept to yourself. Across the years that I have been making these videos, I have received some version of this message hundreds of times. I asked why God would punish me for what someone else did. I was told that was the devil talking. I asked my pastor how it was fair, and he said faith doesn't have to be fair. I asked once. Never again. Pelagius asked once. Loudly. In writing. To the entire Western Church. And here is what happened. Augustine did not answer Pelagius primarily on theological grounds. Not in the end. He answered him politically. In the year 410 AD, the Visigoths sacked Rome. The Eternal City, the center of the Western world for 1,000 years, fell to a barbarian army in 3 days. The shock was enormous. Pagans blamed Christianity. Rome had abandoned the old gods, and the old gods had abandoned Rome. Augustine began his massive response, the City of God, a 30-year project arguing that the true city is not Rome, but the kingdom of God, and that human beings are fallen, divided, incapable of governing themselves, dependent on divine grace mediated through the church. And here is the thing that Elaine Pagels documents so carefully: a theology in which human beings are fundamentally incapable, born broken, born morally defective, unable to save themselves without institutional intervention, is an extraordinarily useful theology for an empire that needs compliant subjects and a church that needs to be indispensable. If you are born guilty, the church becomes necessary, the priest becomes necessary, the sacrament becomes necessary. The institution that can absolve you of a guilt you were born with becomes the most important thing in the world. Pelagius's theology said, you have free will. You have a genuine capacity for good. You are responsible for your own choices. You are not born guilty. Grace assists a genuine moral agent. It does not rescue a fundamentally corrupted one. A theology like that gives institutions considerably less leverage over the people in the pews. Augustine had everything to gain by defeating Pelagius. The Western Church had everything to gain. The collapsing Roman Empire, which had recently made Christianity its official religion and needed the Church to help hold society together, had everything to gain. And so, in May of 418 AD, on a specific day in a specific city, with specific men in specific rooms, the Council of Carthage convened. Carthage in 418 AD was not yet the ruined city it would become. The Vandals would not sack it until 439. In 418, it was still a functioning Roman city, the administrative center of the Diocese of Africa, one of the wealthiest and most theologically active provinces in the Western Church. Bishops and priests gathered from across North Africa and the Western Mediterranean. They came to settle the question Pelagius had raised and Augustine had answered. They passed 8 canons, 8 formal declarations about the nature of human beings and the meaning of grace. Canon 1. Adam was not created mortal. He became mortal because of sin. Death entered through disobedience, not through natural condition. Canon 2. Infants must be baptized for the remission of sins, not as a rite of welcome, not as an act of dedication, but because infants carry the stain of original sin from the moment of birth. A child who dies unbaptized is lost. The guilt came with the birth. Canon 3. The grace of God is not external assistance that helps a fundamentally capable person make better choices. It is rescue from an internal corruption. Human nature is not just weak. Human nature is broken at its foundation. The council condemned Pelagius by name. It condemned anyone who agreed with Pelagius. The Emperor Honorius, to whom Augustine had written repeatedly, applying political pressure, issued an imperial edict. Pelagius and his associates were banished from Rome. His community was dispersed. His writings were condemned. And then, this is the part that I find most remarkable, the part that tells you something about where this doctrine actually came from. The Eastern bishops were brought under pressure to comply. Let me repeat that, because I want you to hear it clearly. The Eastern bishops, the bishops who were reading their New Testament in the original Greek, who understood Pho the way the Greek actually says it, who had always taught that Adam transmitted mortality and not guilt, were initially unwilling to go along with Carthage. Several Eastern councils declined to condemn Pelagius. The Eastern theological tradition was broadly sympathetic to what Pelagius was teaching, because what Pelagius was teaching was, in large measure, what the Eastern Church had always taught. They held out until imperial pressure made resistance too costly. They signed. And then, this is what tells you everything. Once that imperial pressure was eventually lifted, once the Western Roman Empire collapsed and there was no longer an emperor sending letters, the Eastern Church quietly went back to what it had always believed. Mortality, not guilt. Human weakness, not fundamental corruption. The ancestral sin, they call it that in the Orthodox tradition, ancestral sin, or the sin of our ancestor, is the condition of mortality that Adam introduced. The vulnerability to temptation. The fact that we live in a world where death is real and the body is fragile and choices matter enormously. But not inherited guilt. Never inherited guilt. The Eastern Orthodox Church has 1,700 years of continuity from the earliest Christian communities in Antioch and Constantinople and Jerusalem. It has never, not in 1,500 years, not since the Council of Carthage, not once, adopted Augustine's doctrine of inherited guilt. Not officially, not theologically, not in its liturgy, its prayers, its sacramental theology, or its anthropology. The Eastern Church looks at what Augustine built and calls it a Western innovation, a departure from the original, an artifact of one man's psychology, one translation's error, and one empire's political needs. Now, I need to tell you who John Chrysostom was, because Chrysostom did not live in some distant era, safely removed from Augustine's controversy. Chrysostom died in the year 407 AD. Augustine was writing his most important works on original sin in the first decade of the 400s. These were contemporaries, men working in the same theological moment, in the same broad Christian world, just on opposite sides of the Greek-Latin divide. Chrysostom was born in Antioch, in what is now southern Turkey, around the year 349 AD. He was the most influential theologian in the Eastern Church of his generation. He became Archbishop of Constantinople in 398, the Patriarch of the capital city of the Eastern Roman Empire. He was known for preaching with such force and eloquence that the congregations would erupt in applause in the middle of his sermons. His name, Chrysostom, means golden-mouthed. It was not a title he was given at birth. It was a title the Church gave him afterward because of what came out of his mouth. His homilies on Romans, a series of 32 sermons on Paul's letter, are among the most carefully studied texts in the history of biblical commentary. Chrysostom read Romans in the original Greek. He worked through it verse by verse, and when he arrived at Romans 5:12, the verse Augustine would use as the cornerstone of inherited guilt, Chrysostom taught something completely different. Death, Chrysostom argued, entered the world through Adam's transgression. That much was clear. But what spread to humanity was the condition of mortality, not the guilt of the act. Each person who comes after Adam is mortal. Each person is subject to the pressures of a fallen world. Each person has a nature that inclines towards sin, but each person bears responsibility only for their own sins. The guilt of Adam's act belongs to Adam. You bear the weight of your own choices, not his. Same Bible, same passage, same century, different word, because Chrysostom was reading Pho. And Chrysostom knew what Pho meant. Let me tell you about the afternoon I found this out. It was a Saturday. I know it was a Saturday because the parking lot at McKay's Used Books on Chapman Highway was packed the way it only gets on weekends. McKay's is a big, rambling place, the kind of used bookstore where you can walk in at 2 in the afternoon and look up and it's 5:30 and you have no idea where the time went. I've been going there since they opened. They know my face, if not my name. I had been in the theology section, which is where I always end up, which tells you something about the kind of person I am. And I was moving through the spines slowly, the way you do in a used bookstore, not looking for anything specific, just looking. And I pulled out a comparative theology textbook, the kind of dry academic thing that ends up in a used bookstore because a seminary student bought it for a class, underlined every third sentence, and sold it back when the semester ended. The spine was cracked almost all the way through. The binding smell hit me when I opened it. That particular combination of old paper and whatever glue they used in the 1970s. I opened it to the middle, and I found a chapter I had not expected to find. The chapter was on theological anthropology, not the kind that involves bones and excavation, the kind that asks the question, what does a given tradition believe about the fundamental nature of human beings? What are we at our core? There was a table, a simple 2-column comparison. Western Christian anthropology, Roman Catholic and Protestant, on the left. Eastern Orthodox anthropology on the right. Left column, original sin, inherited guilt, human nature fundamentally corrupted by the fall. Grace understood as rescue from an internal defect. Salvation as the solution to a constitutional problem the human being arrived with. Right column, ancestral sin, inherited mortality. Human nature weakened by the fall, but not fundamentally corrupted. Grace understood as healing and transformation. Salvation as restoration of what was damaged, not rescue from what was condemned. I stood in that aisle for what must have been 20 minutes, holding a book I hadn't meant to pick up. Not because the intellectual content was new to me. I was a history teacher. I had 35 years of training in sitting with complicated information without falling apart. I stood there because of what it meant for everything I had spent 63 years believing about myself. The Eastern Orthodox Church. The church with a continuous institutional history from the communities the apostles founded in Antioch and Constantinople and Jerusalem, had never, in any official capacity, taught that I was born guilty. It traced its lineage through John Chrysostom and through the great Greek-speaking theologians of the early church. It read the New Testament in the language the New Testament was written in, and it had always, consistently, as a matter of settled theological consensus, taught that what Adam transmitted was mortality, not guilt. Same Christianity, same scripture, same first-century apostolic communities, completely different anthropology. Nobody had told me this. Not in 35 years of standing in front of a classroom. Not in 22 years of serving as a deacon. Not in the small group Bible studies, or the men's retreats, or the Sunday morning sermons, or the evening services. Nobody had ever walked into a room I was in and said, "Howard, I want you to know that half of world Christianity has always believed something different about what you are." I bought the book. I paid $3.50 for it. I still have it on the shelf behind me right now. That is what $3.50 can do to 50 years of certainty about your own defectiveness. Now, I need to be honest with you about something, because I am not interested in giving you a simple story if the complicated one is the true one. Augustine was not a villain. He was a man of extraordinary intelligence and genuine spiritual searching who built something enormous and real. And there are Eastern theologians who will push back on the sharp contrast I have been drawing, who will tell you that the differences between Western original sin and Eastern ancestral sin are real but not absolute. Both traditions agree that human beings are fallen. Both traditions agree that we need grace. Both traditions agree that the world is not what it was meant to be, and that we are not what we were made to be. I take those arguments seriously. But here is what I cannot get past, and I want to say this as plainly as I know how. The specific claim that a child is born guilty, that before drawing a single breath, before making a single choice, before existing as a conscious moral agent, a human being already carries the weight of an act committed by someone else thousands of years ago. That specific claim is not a universal Christian truth. It is not ancient. The first 3 centuries of Christian writing do not contain it. Origen, Clement of Alexandria, John Chrysostom, the great theologians of the early Eastern tradition, never taught it. What they taught was that Adam brought mortality into the world, that humanity inherited weakness, that the flesh is fragile and the will is compromised by living in a world where death is real, but not guilt, not before the first breath. The doctrine of inherited guilt, original sin in the precise Augustinian sense, is a 5th century Western innovation, built by one man, codified by one council, sustained by political forces that benefited enormously from a population that believed itself constitutionally incapable of saving itself. And the oldest continuous Christian tradition in the world has never accepted it. That is not my opinion. That is the documented, well-attested, available to anyone who looks theological position of the Eastern Orthodox Church, which represents somewhere between 200 and 260 million Christians worldwide, and which has been reading the New Testament in its original Greek language without interruption since the 1st century. Elaine Pagels, whose scholarship I have returned to more times than I can count since that first Mackay's afternoon, because she is one of those rare academics who writes with both rigor and humanity, makes an argument in Adam, Eve, and the serpent that I find impossible to dismiss. She documents what she calls the political afterlife of original sin. Once the Roman Empire became Christian, once Constantine's conversion and his successors' policies made Christianity the state religion of the most powerful political entity in the world, a theological question that had seemed academic became extremely practical. What kind of subjects does an empire need? It needs subjects who believe they require the institution, who are convinced that without the mediation of the church, without the priest, without the sacrament, without the absolution that only authorized personnel can provide, they are constitutionally, fundamentally, by the nature with which they were born, lost. What kind of citizens is it hardest to govern? Citizens who believe they have genuine free will, who believe they are moral agents capable of choosing the good on their own authority, who believe their conscience is a sufficient guide and that no institution has a monopoly on their access to God. Pelagius's theology produces the second kind of human being. Augustine's theology produces the first. Pagels is not arguing that Augustine consciously chose his doctrine because it served imperial interests. She is arguing something more subtle and, I think, more true, that a doctrine survives and triumphs not only because of its theological merit, but because of its institutional utility. Original sin survived 1,500 years not because it was the most faithful reading of the Greek text. The Eastern Church demonstrates that it was not, but because it was the most useful reading for the institutions that controlled what got taught and who got condemned for teaching otherwise. Pelagius asked a child's question. He was declared a heretic. He was right about the Greek. He was defeated by the Latin. I want to come back to Mrs. Evelyn Cates. Not because I am angry at her, I am not. She was a woman in her 70s who had been teaching that Sunday school class since before the Second World War. She believed every word she said. She believed she was doing good, and in many ways she was. She was kind. She was consistent. She showed up every single week with her brooch and her worn King James Bible, and her genuine investment in 8-year-old children who were mostly thinking about the football game that afternoon. She was not lying. She was passing on what she had received. But what she had received, what I received through her, what that Sunday school basement poured into an 8-year-old boy looking down at his own hands, was Augustine's reading of a Latin mistranslation of a Greek verse, codified by a council convened in a falling empire, preserved by institutions that had a political stake in making human beings feel that they were not, on their own, enough. That is not a mystery of God. That is a documented historical process available to anyone who wants to look. And what I keep coming back to, what I find myself returning to, sitting at this desk, late at night, going through these notes, is this. How many people are still carrying that weight? How many people left the church, left the faith, walked away from everything they were raised in, and took the shame with them? Not the theology, the shame, the deep, installed, pre-rational conviction that there is something wrong with them that was there before they did anything wrong. The thing that makes them feel like they have to earn their own existence, even decades after they stopped believing any of it. That specific kind of shame, the shame of being told you are guilty before you have done anything, that does not come from the text. It does not come from the original Greek. It does not come from the 1800 years of Eastern Christianity that has never once told its people they were born guilty. It comes from one man's reading of a mistranslated word, and a council that found it useful, and institutions that kept it because it kept them necessary. Before I give you the last piece of this, if what you have seen today has been worth your time, consider supporting this channel through Super Thanks. I want to be direct about what that means for this work. These investigations take weeks, tracking a doctrine back through Chrysostom and Pelagius and the Council of Carthage and the mistranslation of a single Greek phrase. That is not something that happens in an afternoon. Your support is what makes it possible to keep going instead of stopping. It matters. So, let me give you the complete picture. In the year 354 AD, a brilliant and troubled man was born in Roman North Africa. He spent his youth in what he experienced as moral failure, pleasure, desire, a life his conscience told him was wrong. He converted to Christianity in his early 30s. He became a bishop. He spent 4 decades writing the most influential theology in the history of Western civilization. And when he tried to explain why human beings sin, why even people who want to do good so often cannot, he reached for a single verse in Paul's letter to the Romans. He read it in Latin. The Latin said in quo, "In whom all humanity sinned inside Adam. The guilt was there from the beginning. You carried it into the world with you before you drew your first breath." The Eastern Church, which was reading the same verse in Greek, read F-ho, because of which? Because of what Adam did, death spread. Because all have sinned on their own account. 2 words, different languages, completely different understanding of what a human being is. In May of 418 AD, the Council of Carthage made the Latin reading official. It condemned the man, Pelagius, who had argued for something closer to the Greek. It passed 8 canons declaring that guilt was inherited, that infants were born stained, that human nature was fundamentally broken. The Eastern Church signed under pressure. And then, when the pressure was gone, went back to what it had always believed. 1,500 years later, the Eastern Orthodox Church, 260 million Christians, does not teach that you were born guilty. It has never taught that. It has consistently, formally, liturgically, and theologically maintained that what Adam transmitted was mortality, not guilt, weakness, not condemnation, the ancestral wound, not the inherited verdict, the shame you were taught. If you were taught it, If you sat in a basement Sunday school room and looked down at your hands because someone told you that what you were was already wrong, that shame was not written into creation. It was not universal Christian truth. It was not the oldest reading of the oldest text. It was one man, shaped by his own history, one mistranslated word, one council in a collapsing empire, and 500 years of political utility. The shame has an address. It has a date. It has a name. And when you know those things, when you can put your finger on the street corner where the shame was made, it does not disappear. I will not promise you that. But it begins to belong to history instead of to you. The Eastern Church has always taught that you were born mortal, not guilty, born into a fragile world, not into a verdict. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, the difference between a whole theology and a broken one. The guilt was not written into creation. It was written into a council in 418 AD in a language that wasn't the original, by a man working out his own history. And the church that never stopped reading the original language has always known that. I want to leave you with a genuine question, not a rhetorical one. Growing up in whatever tradition you came from, did anyone ever tell you the Eastern Orthodox Church existed? Did any Sunday school teacher, any pastor, any confirmation class, any small group Bible study ever mention that there is a form of Christianity representing hundreds of millions of people that has never, not once, taught that you were born guilty? Write your answer in the comments. I read everyone. And if you have been carrying the shame of original sin for years, decades maybe, and nobody ever told you that half of world Christianity has always called it a Western invention built on a mistranslated word, write "still here" in the comments. It tells me you're out there. It means more than you know. I'll see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves.